I'm Jeff Allen Wolf, and this is A World Gone Mad, and I'm not backing down. Here we go. U.S. and Iranian militaries trade shots as the Strait of Hormuz tensions escalate. Is this surprising anyone? Of course not. Due to ego, specifically Donald Trump's ego, he will not end this. He will not negotiate because he wants it his way or not at all. Hope I'm wrong, but I don't think this is going to end well. It certainly hasn't gone well from the start. And here's where this stops being some story over there and starts being everybody's problem. This isn't two countries yelling across a random body of water. This is the Strait of Hormuz. It's one of the most important arteries in the global economy, and we're now watching it turn into a pressure cooker with warships. So when you hear they're trading shots, what that really means is the world's energy supply is sitting in the middle of a standoff and hoping nobody sneezes, blinks, panics, or decides they need to look tough for the cameras. Because this is how it always goes. Nobody calls it escalation. Nobody says, we're making this worse. Every move's measured. Every response is necessary. Every step's controlled. Which is amazing because nothing says under control quite like two militaries firing at each other near one of the most sensitive choke points on Earth. Right up until it isn't. Right up until someone goes one step further than the other side expected. And now you're not managing anything anymore. You're reacting. And once you're reacting, the mission changes. It stops being, how do we stop this? And becomes, how do I avoid looking weak on television? Definitely talking about Donald Trump here. And that's how adults with missiles end up acting like toddlers with access to a defense budget. Because once it becomes about who looks strong instead of what actually makes sense, the off-ramp disappears. Every move has to be answered. Every action has to be matched. Nobody wants to be the one who blinks first, even though blinking may be the only intelligent thing left in the room. People thousands of miles away start paying for decisions they have nothing to do with. They don't get a vote. They don't get a briefing. They just wake up, go to the gas station, look at the price, and wonder which genius decided to play chicken with the global economy. That's why this matters. Not because of the headline, but because of the pattern. We've seen this before. Different players, same stupidity. Tension builds. Lines get pushed. Everyone says it's under control. And then one move changes everything. And at that point, there's no clean rewind button. There's no easy reset. There's just the same old sentence that always comes after bad decisions by powerful people. Nobody could have predicted this. Except plenty of people could. They just weren't the ones being listened to. And if that wasn't enough of a problem, Trump and the GOP push for aggressive voter roll purges up until Election Day, testing precedent. Sure, why the hell not? Let's eliminate all voters that can hurt us, Trump and MAGA state. But the deeply disturbing part is obvious. It's not that they're doing this. It's that they're doing this in broad daylight, and they don't give a shit. They'll rig the election in plain view of the world and not give a damn. And here's where this stops sounding like paperwork and starts sounding like strategy. Because voter roll purges sounds harmless, right? It sounds like somebody's just cleaning out a junk drawer. Old names, duplicates, no big deal. Except it's not a junk drawer. It's the list that decides who gets to vote and who shows up on Election Day and gets told, sorry, you're not on the list. and they're doing it right up to the edge of an election. Not months before, not with time to fix mistakes, but right when people don't have time to do anything about it, which is convenient, very convenient, because if there's one thing bureaucratic systems are known for, it's being fast, responsive, and easy to fix at the last minute. Yeah, that's definitely how that works. And then you get the explanation. It's about accuracy. It's about security. It's about keeping the rolls clean, which sounds great because nobody's arguing for messy, inaccurate voter rolls. That's not the argument. The argument is how you're doing it and when you're doing it. Because timing's not a detail. Timing's the whole thing. If you remove people from the rolls close to an election, you're not just cleaning data. You're increasing the chances that real voters show up and get blocked. Not because they did anything wrong, but because something in the system says they don't belong here anymore. And good luck fixing that on election day. That's not a quick phone call. That's a maze. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Because all of this is happening out in the open. Not hidden, not subtle, not something you have to dig to find. It's right there, which tells you something. It tells you they don't think there's a downside to doing it this way. They don't think they're going to pay a price for it. And when people in power start acting like there's no downside, that's when you should start paying attention. Because this isn't just about one election cycle. It's about what people start to expect from the system. If the rules feel like they can shift right up to the last minute, people stop trusting the process. And once that trust starts to crack, it doesn't magically come back the next time around. It carries over. So no, this doesn't feel like routine maintenance. It feels like pushing the limits to see how far you can go without getting real pushback. And once that line moves, it doesn't move back on its own. And that's the part that should actually bother people. Not the talking points, not the press releases, but the idea that something this important can be adjusted this late, and everyone's just supposed to shrug and say, well, I'm sure it's fine. Because history's full of moments where people said, I'm sure it's fine. And it wasn't. Okay, Todd Blanche, the acting attorney general, did he say that people need IDs to get into restaurants? And this is one of those moments where you hear it and you think, there's no way that's what was actually said by Todd. There's got to be one of those video clips that's missing context, missing tone, missing something. Because nobody walks into a restaurant, sits down, orders a burger, and gets carded like they're trying to get into a nightclub at 2 a.m. But then you look at what Blanche was actually doing. It starts to make more sense. Not because it's correct, but because it's familiar. This is the move. You take something already accepted in a limited context, like showing ID for alcohol, and you stretch it until it sounds like it applies everywhere. Not because it does, but because it feels like it might if you don't think about it for more than 5 seconds. And that's the key. It's not about whether the example is accurate. It's about whether it lands just enough to get people nodding along. Because once people start thinking, well, yeah, we show ID all the time, the next step slides in without much resistance. It sounds normal, even if the comparison itself doesn't actually hold up. Because in reality, you don't need an ID to eat at most restaurants. You don't need ID to walk into a diner, sit down, and order food. Nobody's checking your identification to make sure you're eligible to have pancakes. That's not how that works, and everybody knows it the second they stop and think about it. So why use that example, Todd Blanche? Because it's simple, because it's easy, because it blurs the line just enough to make something sound more common than it actually is. And that's how these arguments get built. Not on precision, not on accuracy, but on something that sounds close enough to reality that people don't immediately reject it. And this is where it becomes a problem. Because once the comparison gets accepted, even loosely, it starts shaping how people think about the actual issue. It reframes the conversation. It moves it away from the details and into this vague sense of, well, we already do this here, so what's the big deal doing it here? Except the details are the entire deal. The difference between showing ID to buy a drink and requiring ID in other situations is not small. It's not interchangeable. But when you flatten it into a single, easy to digest comparison, those differences disappear, at least on the surface. And that's what you're watching here, Wolfpack, okay? Not a policy announcement, not a literal statement that you need ID to eat at a restaurant, but a rhetorical move designed to make something sound more normal than it actually is. And the frustrating part is how effective that can be. Because once something sounds familiar, people stop questioning it. They stop digging into it. They accept it as part of the background noise. Until someone points out that it doesn't actually work the way it was just described. And then you're back to square one, trying to separate what was said from what was implied, and what was implied from what people heard. And that's how something like this takes off. Not because it's completely accurate, but because it's just believable enough to spread. Okay, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani is in critical condition with pneumonia. That's what a spokesperson says. Look, I'm a nice person. Jeff is a nice person. I'm kind. I'm decent. I'm civil. And when I heard about Giuliani, my reaction was visceral. Rudy Giuliani is in critical condition. Good. And I know that's wrong on a deep level, but how can one not feel this way towards this person? He was the bottom of the barrel in Trump's swamp scum collection. I'm wondering if any of my listeners think I'm wrong about this. And if you think this was a wonderful human being, it'd be interesting to hear from you and your take on this. And here's what makes this so uncomfortable. Not the headline, the reaction to it. Because when people hear news like this and don't immediately go to sympathy, that doesn't come out of nowhere, people. That's built. That's earned over time. Because there was a version of Rudy Giuliani that some people respected. That's not revisionist history, that's reality. And then there's the version people have watched for the last several years. And those two versions don't even look like the same person. At some point, it stopped being a full fall, on Giuliani and started being a full sprint in the opposite direction for Giuliani. And that's what people are reacting to. Not the title, not the past, but the behavior. The constant, repeated public decisions that made people go from, this guy was taken seriously, to, what am I even watching right now? And once that switch flips, it doesn't flip back just because the headline changes. People want clean reactions. They want sympathy or outrage. Something simple, something easy, but that's not how this works. When someone like Giuliani spends years burning through credibility in public, people remember that. They don't just reset because they're supposed to. And that doesn't mean celebrating anything. It means being honest about why the reaction isn't what it used to be. There's a difference between wishing harm on someone and not being able to summon sympathy the way you might years ago. Those aren't the same things, even if people try to pretend they are. If you're listening to this and thinking, that reaction doesn't sit right, you're not wrong. But if you're also thinking, I get why people feel that way, you're not wrong either. Both of those things can exist at the same time. And that's where this actually lives. Not in the headline, not in the condition, but in what happens to public trust when someone spends years tearing it apart themselves. Because once that's gone, it doesn't come back on demand. And moments like this about Giuliani's health don't rebuild it. They just reveal what's left. And finally, GameStop makes a daring $56 billion bid for eBay, hoping to rival Amazon. Now this caught my eye and I said out loud, really? The game stores, GameStop? And they're not doing well to the naked eye from my viewpoint. They're trying to buy eBay? GameStop made an unsolicited $56 billion bid to acquire e-commerce giant eBay, a company with a market value nearly 4 times higher than them, as the video game realtor seeks to boost profitability. Now, eBay confirmed the offer on Monday, said that there had been no prior discussion or outreach with GameStop before receiving the offer. GameStop, which is worth roughly $12 billion, is attempting to buy the online bidding giant in a deal that would consist of half cash, half stock buyout, with just around $9 billion in cash and a debt load of $4.2 billion. So CEO Ryan Cohen argued that he could replicate his cost-cutting playbook at GameStop to boost eBay's profitability, while tapping GameStop's approximately 1,600 U.S. stores into a physical network to make eBay a better competitor to Amazon. And this is where you stop and just stare at the screen for a second while reading this, because on paper this sounds less like a business strategy, more like someone walked into a bank with $12 billion and tried to buy the building. You've got a company worth about $12 billion, GameStop, trying to buy a company worth roughly 4 times them, with half the deal coming from cash that they don't fully have, and the other half coming from stock that depends on people believing this makes sense in the first place. That's not confidence. That's optimism doing a backflip. And the pitch is, don't worry, we'll cut costs, we'll streamline things, and we'll turn 1,600 brick and mortar stores into some kind of physical backbone for eBay to compete with Amazon. Which sounds great until you remember those are the same stores people have been saying for years are part of the problem, not the solution. So, the idea is take a struggling retail footprint like GameStop, bolt it onto an online marketplace that already exists, and somehow that becomes Amazon. That's not a strategy. That's a wish with a press release. And the best part is that eBay didn't even see it coming. No talks, no build-up, just a $56 billion offer landing out of nowhere like, hey, we'd like to buy you. Don't worry about the math. This isn't daring. This is what happens when ambition gets way ahead of reality and nobody in the room says, maybe we should slow down for a second and look at the numbers. Because competing with Amazon, that's hard enough. Doing it by trying to buy something 4 times your size with money you don't fully have, that's not bold. That's the kind of move that makes everyone else double check they're not missing something obvious. I would appreciate your comments on this episode or anything from any previous episode. The email is wolfpacktalks@gmail.com. I'm Jeff Allen Wolf. This is A World Gone Mad. I'll be back Wednesday. Until then, I urge the Wolf Pack, remain skeptical, question everything. Please, don't lose hope, and most of all, stay alert.